So today we'll be talking about Chapter 31, Section 1. It's called Latinos and Native Americans Seek Equality. We'll be talking about some of the injustices confronted in the 1960s and some of the enduring challenges today. But, hey, let's start with the song.
Now it's time for a brief history of the United States of America. Hi, boys and
Yeah, so I like to play that song as a recap of a lot of the big things that we've been talking about. And, often we get to the end of Vietnam and we think, okay, okay, everything's fixed. The civil rights movement has been conducted. The war is over. Yay, happy times. Well, we've still got some struggles. And I'm going to start with the Latino population, our fastest growing minority. In fact, soon to be, within our lifetimes, a majority of the American populace. The largest group within the Latino community are families hailing from Mexico, mostly from living in the Southwest, around the California region. But of course, Latinos have migrated all over this country. And so by 1960, again, Mexican Americans were the largest group of this, but there were around 900,000 Puerto Ricans at this time, well over 1 million, living in the United States, mainly in New York City. The concentration of the Cuban population is generally around Miami, but again, you can meet Puerto Ricans, you can meet Cubans all over the country. And many folks even coming from further south in Mexico, like Colombia, Nicaragua, Venezuela, fleeing to escape civil unrest, poverty, violence. And yet, like we've talked about over and over with African Americans, Latinos have also encountered prejudice and discrimination, particularly in jobs and housing. We're seeing this with the plight of the migrant farmer and the grapes of wrath, and we're seeing this played out in today's world as well. So what has been done? What can be done? Well, one of the most powerful movements is when people come together, when people work together for change. For example, when Cesar Chavez founded the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee, the situation in 1965 was that immigrants in this country were working for wages that were unlivable. You're seeing this in Grapes of Wrath, how farmers are being paid a wage that they can barely afford to feed their families on. And employers are continuing to lower wages because there are no laws protecting immigrants. And so all that can really be done is for these immigrant groups to join together. But many of you guys also pointed out that raising awareness of an issue, bringing attention to an issue, is a powerful and important tactic. Well, for one, we have to acknowledge that Latinos are the largest minority in this country and will be soon the largest people group in this country. And that means, this community needs better schools, needs better resources. And, the fact that many folks in this country are paying into the tax system but not receiving those benefits is deplorable. But yet, in 1968, the Bilingual Education Act provided funding for ELA programs, helping young people to learn English and acclimate better to public schools.
Not much wood.
As the equipment up.
We don't need that.
A baby is born. In that miraculous moment, the future for this new little American citizen seems limitless. But wait, take a closer look. Is this newborn a boy or a girl? White, black, or brown? Rich or poor? The answer to those questions may affect this child's future.
In order to think about how governments treat people differently on a number of ascriptive characteristics, race, ethnicity, gender, one needs to really go back to the founding of the country. We talk currently as if, in fact, The Constitution that we have, that is a wonderful document and uses inclusive language, was always inclusive. And the reality is that it wasn't. The founders created a document for themselves and explicitly excluded lots of other people who were here at the founding. White women, blacks, American Indians, and initially unpropertied white males.
In the 18th century, the total political population in North America, I estimated 700,000 people. The total population of maybe 3 million. But we're talking about a very restricted population of adult white males. And that, to whom all of these ideas applied, that is a very small number.
But even in these early days, there was an awareness that the views of our forefathers were restrictive. As John Adams worked on issues related to the Constitution, his wife Abigail wrote, "In the new code of laws, remember the ladies, and do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands." John Adams replied, "I cannot but laugh. Depend upon it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems."
The beauty of the Constitution is because the language was inclusive, it provided the opening for all of these previously excluded groups to make demands on the system to be brought into the system. And it's been a long struggle on the part of Black Americans, American Indians, white women, and then later groups that came in, Asian Americans, Latinos. And we're still struggling with trying to make the language of the Constitution match up to our behavior and attitudes towards everybody who's a part of this system.
And so, what can a disenfranchised group do to help their community? What can a group that has been historically looked down upon, historically mistreated? Well, in the case of Latinos, they have organized. They have worked together to elect Latino candidates into major political parties. They formed groups, unions like the League of United Latin American Citizens, and that one's been in existence since 1929. Or even La Raza Unida, which has worked on improving and empowering the Latino community. And it's a grassroots movement, meaning here at the local level, seeking to get young Latinos to run for office. I've said it over and over again, that if you really want to see change, don't wait on it. Be a part of it. If you really have an issue that you want to see changed, run for office. Be a part of it. And that's what these movements are all about, is if we can get more representation for these communities, then we can begin to see progress. But it also takes confrontation. Some of you guys mentioned those peaceful resistance movements. And yes, these have been going on for quite some time. But now I want to talk about Native Americans. Many Native Americans have stayed within their communities, have stayed on reservations, be it Oklahoma or the Dakotas or even here in North Carolina. Generally, Native Americans are one of the poorest groups in our country, have some of the highest levels of unemployment, highest infant mortality rates. In the 1960s, a program was tried called the Termination Policy. And this was aimed at empowering minority groups through a lack of help. The hope that if we cut off groups from assistance, they'll learn to provide for themselves. And it was a horrible failure. It did not solve the problems. In fact, it was often aimed at relocating Native Americans to unwanted regions of their territories, so that basically wealthier people could buy out the more desirable land. But By 1968, the president had established a National Council on Indian Opportunity. But just like we talked about with the Latin American community, the American Indian movement is a widespread, nationwide Native American rights organization.
With the passage of time has come change, but not without a struggle.
One of the first things that these excluded groups had to do, with the exception of white women, was attain citizenship. White women were excluded from the political process, but they were always considered citizens of the United States. Blacks were not considered citizens, and there were no rights that blacks had that a white man was bound to respect.
And gradually, in the course of the 19th century, that shifts and changes and radiates out until, of course, the Civil War brings on the three great amendments, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, which liberate the slaves, abolishes slavery, and creates in formal constitutional terms those rights for the black population. It isn't until 1920 that that applies to women in the 19th Amendment.
American Indians did not achieve citizenship en masse until 1924 with the Indian Citizenship Act. So from the very founding to 1924, you have a group of people who are viewed as essentially aliens or wards. That was the terminology that the United States used relative to Indians.
But the ideals expressed in this act and those amendments had a long way to go.
Sunflower Elm Management does not allow us to serve niggers in here.
In fact, the formal extension of it in constitutional legal form often hasn't applied to reality. And so after the Civil War amendments, of course, there's a century of Jim Crow, which has to be eliminated as it has in part in the 1960s, but still is not fulfilled.
The court is very conservative, and indeed, I'd say more than conservative, it's hostile to some of the claims that civil rights lawyers have brought in the past. But on the other hand, the fact that lawyers can't necessarily go to court and rely on the judges to grant them relief means that lawyers have to be more creative and have to be more engaged in movements.
Some progress has been achieved as a result of legislation.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964, which has, certainly not by itself, but by the opportunity it afforded individuals to claim their own civil rights, has really taken us quite far.
This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice in our beloved country.
The Civil Rights Act contains many provisions having to do with public accommodations and public education with respect to race discrimination, but probably the most famous and in some respects most controversial aspect of the Civil Rights Act is Title VII. Title VII is a provision of the Act which prohibits discrimination in employment on the basis of race, religion, national origin, and sex. For example, height and weight requirements that were there to keep women out when there was no real justification for that. And over the course of the 70s and 80s, those kinds of discriminations were attacked in court. Brilliant legal thinking and argument and very resilient workers who were willing to suffer the consequences personally of bringing these sorts of cases to the fore.
Women cannot be abused in the workplace without having any remedy. People of color can get jobs. People who suffer physical handicaps can be accommodated in many ways which did not exist before.
And so, what we're seeing in these clips is that the laws that we've talked about are very important. But you even heard it from President Johnson. The laws are a challenge to each of us to seek our civil rights. And you heard the lady say that in many cases, people advocating for the civil rights that we now take for granted did so at their own personal risk. In this week's reading in Grapes of Wrath, you're going to I don't want to spoil it because it's huge, but you're going to see someone advocating for better rights for their community, and you're going to see some very extreme repercussions. So if you haven't read it yet, please do. It's big stuff. So in 1972, the American Indian Movement actually led a march on D.C. They were seeking to protest treaty violations. For example, that their reservations were getting smaller and smaller, that the termination policy was affecting them in a negative way, that it's time for people to recognize Native Americans as a community and to treat them as equals. There was a group in 1973 that felt that peaceful change was not working. And so they actually seized the town of Wounded Knee, the famous site of the massacre of hundreds of Sioux men, women, and children. And in a shootout with the FBI, these people were arrested and killed. Now, through the 1970s, laws gave tribes even greater control over their own affairs. For example, schools, so the Cherokee Reservation here runs their own school system. They have their own buses, they have their own teachers. It's entirely managed through the reservation and outside of the jurisdiction of the state of North Carolina. Through the 1970s and 80s, the courts began to recognize greater autonomy on tribal lands and even began to award financial compensation for the lands that had been taken from them. So if you've ever wondered if you have a friend or a relative who has a percentage of Native American ancestry and lives on the reservation and they receive financial compensation, it's due to these cases dating back to the 70s and 80s where these people now receive financial compensation in return to the lands that were taken from them.